few days ago, some woman named Mooncat made a video where she claims to have debunked evolutionary psychology. So I'm going to make a lazy response to this video. I'm not going to cut up any clips or anything. I'm just going to do a very quick response to this. So in the first place, this is a very presumptuous title. Even though I'm a hereditarian and I tend to think sociological explanations are wrong, I would never presume to say that sociological theory is totally debunked or that it's totally wrong. Maybe it can get some things correct every now and then. And it's really just setting yourself up for embarrassment to say something like that, okay? Declaring an entire field to be debunked is nonsense, because what if they happen to be right about something, even just one thing? Well, now you look like an asshole. So I'm going to make a quick response. The original video is over 3 hours long, and most of it's just unfunny skits and libtard snark substituted for arguments. You know, that thing they do where they take a serious subject and personalize it and try to use it to make fun of people who hold the position. That's not really an argument. The first objection she makes is that the way evolutionary psychologists view humans is inhuman, and that they're just reducing humanity to numbers and statistics. She says something like, "Why not view us as human beings who help out the group?" Her criticism is essentially that evopsych isn't critical theory. She complains that evopsych paints a cynical view of human behavior and that it's effectively not egalitarian or cooperative enough. So her criticism boils down to evopsych isn't critical theory. Yeah, that's the point. Evopsych is an empirical science. Its purpose is to describe reality by making predictions, not to offer prescriptions about reality. The goal of any empirical discipline is just to describe truth. It's not critical theory. It never will be critical theory. The goal is to find out what humans are doing right now and find out why they're doing that right now, not to engineer ways to change human behavior according to your own subjective standards. So maybe you think the conclusions evolutionary psychology comes to are cynical or dreary, but that's just like your opinion. Maybe human behavior is very competitive. Maybe that's just true. And did human groups in history get together and sing Kumbaya? No, they went to war. The Neanderthals were wiped out through warfare and interbreeding. They didn't peacefully coexist. If you don't like that, that's fine, but stop complaining about the guys who are just trying to find out what's going on. Then she makes the first substantive critique of the video. She argues that evolutionary psychology is full of untestable just-so stories, and even further argues that evolutionary hypotheses themselves are completely untestable and unfalsifiable. But here, she didn't even do cursory research into this question, because I was able to find on Wikipedia a whole article going over this question with several responses to this objection. Before I read this article, I'm just going to sum up the basic punchline. When you have multiple competing explanations for a given trait, they're going to be mutually exclusive and are going to predict different knock-on effects. You can compare different explanations. Even a sociological explanation can be compared with an evolutionary one, but of course the argument that a trait is completely the result of learned behavior is absurd, since all behavior is at least somewhat heritable. In other words, evolution did not stop at the neck. Mental traits evolve with the brain. So Leda Cosmides, who pioneered the field alongside her husband, argued, "Those who have a professional knowledge of evolutionary biology know that it's not possible to cook up after-the-fact explanations of just any trait. There are important constraints on evolutionary explanation. More to the point, every decent evolutionary explanation has testable predictions about the design of the trait. For example, the hypothesis that pregnancy sickness is a byproduct of prenatal hormones predicts different patterns of food aversions than the hypothesis that it is an adaptation that evolved to protect the fetus from pathogens and plant toxins in the food at the point in embryogenesis when the fetus is most vulnerable, during the first trimester. Evolutionary hypotheses, whether generated to discover a new trait or to explain one that is already known, carry predictions about the nature of that trait. The alternative, having no hypothesis about adaptive function, carries no predictions whatsoever. So which is the more constrained and sober scientific approach?" A 2010 review article by evolutionary psychologists describes how an evolutionary theory may be empirically tested. A hypothesis is made about the evolutionary cause of a psychological phenomenon or phenomena. Then the researcher makes predictions that can be tested. This involves predicting that the evolutionary cause will have caused other effects than the ones already discovered and known. Then these predictions are tested. The authors argue numerous evolutionary theories have been tested in this way and confirmed or falsified. Buller 2005 makes the point that the entire field of evolutionary psychology is never confirmed or falsified. Only specific hypotheses, motivated by the general assumptions of evolutionary psychology, are testable. Accordingly, he views evolutionary psychology as a paradigm rather than a theory, and attributes this view to prominent evolutionary psychologists including Cosmides, Tooby, Buss, and Pinker. In his review, Discovery and Confirmation in Evolutionary Psychology, Edward Macri concludes, evolutionary psychology remains a very controversial approach in psychology, maybe because skeptics sometimes have little first-hand knowledge of this field, maybe because the research done by evolutionary psychologists is of uneven quality. However, there is little reason to endorse a principled skepticism toward evolutionary psychology. Although clearly fallible, the discovery heuristics and the strategies of confirmation used by evolutionary psychologists are on a firm grounding. Steve Stuart Williams argues, in response to claims that evolutionary psychology hypotheses are unfalsifiable, that such claims are logically incoherent. Stuart Williams argues that if evolutionary psychology hypotheses can't be falsified, then neither could be competing explanations, because if alternative explanations, e.g. sociocultural hypotheses, are proven true, this would automatically falsify the competing evolutionary psychology hypothesis. So for competing explanations to be true, then evolutionary psychology hypothesis must be false and thus falsifiable. Edward Hagen observes that critics of evolutionary psychology often argue that because a trait could have evolved as an adaptation or a byproduct, it is impossible to determine which it is since it evolved in a past environment, and thus evolutionary psychology hypotheses about a trait's origin are untestable. According to Hagen, critics using this argument have a flawed understanding of science. Hagen argues that science is fundamentally an abductivist methodology, e.g. inference to the best explanation. Hagen argues that hypotheses compete to provide the best explanation of a phenomenon, where best is measured by criteria like predicting new and surprising observations, parsimony, coherence, and so on. Abduction does not require a scientist to provide direct evidence for every single prediction. Evolutionary psychology hypotheses make predictions and thus compete with other hypotheses to explain traits. Hagen further argues that while some critics conclude that evolutionary psychology explanations for mental traits cannot be true because they can't be tested for the above reasons, this is a false conclusion to draw. Even if evolutionary psychology hypotheses could not be tested, this does not mean they are false, it just means that the evidence for them could not be acquired, not that the traits don't exist for evolutionary reasons. Dominic Murphy explains that one of the most common objections to evolutionary psychology is the time machine argument. This is the argument that while evolutionary psychology can make predictions about things we should see in the modern world, if the evolutionary psychology hypothesis is true, there are too many alternate explanations for the origin of a trait which would also predict this phenomenon. E.g., a trait evolving as a byproduct could predict the same evidence as the same trait evolving as an adaptation. Therefore, a potentially infinite number of alternative historical explanations are possible. Thus, without a time machine, it is impossible to determine which possible explanation for the evidence seen in the modern day is correct. Murphy argues this argument is flawed on multiple grounds. Firstly, if an explanation for a trait is forwarded and a prediction for what we would see in the modern day is made based on the explanation, then one cannot just propose alternate explanations. Instead, these alternative explanations require testable predictions of their own to be forwarded, preferably multiple different predictions. In addition, not all explanations may predict the same evidence. Thus, Murphy argues that if one explanation predicts a great deal of evidence from modern-day observations and alternative explanations struggle to explain this, then it is reasonable to have confidence in the former explanation. In addition, Murphy argues that if the time machine argument was applied to other sciences, it would lead to absurd results. Murphy observes that cosmologists have confirmed predictions about the Big Bang by studying available astronomical evidence and current understanding of particle physics, with no need of a time machine to travel back to the beginning of the universe. Similarly, geologists and physicists investigating the hypothesis that it was an asteroid impact that caused the extinction of the dinosaurs did so by looking for modern-day evidence. Murphy thus concludes that the onus is on the skeptics to prove why evolutionary psychology is allegedly untestable on time machine grounds if other historical sciences are not, as a method should be judged across the board, not singled out for ridicule in one context. A similar argument was made by Andrew Goldfinch, who argued that this entire criticism is due to the issue of underdetermination. Many rival explanations can potentially accommodate a phenomenon, making it difficult to discern which explanation is the correct one. Furthermore, one can also challenge the interpretation of an experiment's results, revise an explanation to accommodate a novel fact, or even question the reliability of the experiments conducted. However, Goldfinch argues that this is a ubiquitous problem in all of science and not unique to evolutionary psychology, so it is not clear why this is seen as a criticism of the field if it would be dismissed elsewhere. Lastly, Goldfinch argues that one way to distinguish between competing explanations is to make a distinction between programs that make new predictions and discovers novel facts, and those programs that simply accommodate the fresh discoveries of other programs. Those programs which are actually making and testing predictions should be favored over those simply accommodating the discoveries of others. Now, Mooncat says there isn't enough evidence to validate the claims of evolutionary psychology, but according to what standard? That isn't a methodological critique, that's just your opinion. Liberals do this all the time when confronted with hereditary explanations of human behavior. They see the evidence, then declare that it isn't enough according to their own arbitrary personal standard. They do this, as we will see later, mostly with genes. You have to find the genes, we haven't found enough genes, etc. Naturally, no amount of evidence is ever enough for them. They will just keep shifting the goalposts. When the question is one out of several competing theories that attempt to explain human behavior, When the question is which one out of several competing theories that attempt to explain human behavior is the most likely to be true, they will always favor the sociological one, regardless of the available evidence, simply because that's what they favor. Their egalitarian worldview necessitates it, and when you really strip the egalitarian explanation down, it's just a circular argument. Human behavior varies because of differences in culture. Differences in culture exist because of differences in language. Differences in language exist because of arbitrary choice, which is the basis for differences in culture. So basically, human behavior differs because culture differs, and culture differs because human behavior differs. They never have an explanation for human behavior. It's always left up to arbitrary choices or some sort of socially necessary system of signs and responses, or something like Derrida's difference, basically just a circular linguistic explanation. There's no room in their theory for innate differences in human behavior that originate from biology and evolution, because the moment they admit that, then the notion of egalitarianism falls apart. Next, she complains about the theory that disgust sensitivity correlates with political views and that there is an evolutionary basis for it. I'm not really going to dive into the literature here, but her competing explanation for the EvoPsych one is cultural, that people just learn different disgust responses, that it's all culturally determined, since disgust sensitivity isn't really all that evident until the age of 5. But there are a couple problems with this. The first one is that disgust isn't completely arbitrary. There's studies you can find on the efficacy of aversion therapy for converting homosexuals or for treating alcoholism, and it's not really that effective in the long term. It doesn't create lasting trends, and over time, the effects go away. It's really hard to condition someone into or out of their natural disgust response in this stable way, and it really just seems like environmental interventions only last as long as you keep the stimulus going. 1950 study and evaluation of aversion in LSD therapy and the treatment of alcoholism by C.G. Costello found that after 5 years, only 23% remained alcohol-free, according to 60% in the first year. The basic fact is that the differences we see in disgust sensitivity are real, and they don't seem to go away. They seem to have a pretty stable correlation based on political views. Now, as for why disgust sensitivity only forms around 5 years of age, that might be the result of something called gene amplification. The younger you are, the less expressed your genes are. Let's say there's something like a maximum genetic potential that you reach when you're about 18. When you're a baby, you haven't even begun to reach that maximum potential yet. Your genes are barely at all expressed. But as you age, that gene expression becomes fuller and fuller. This is why IQ isn't all that much heritable until about the age of 14 to 18. It's because of gene amplification. Babies probably can't express the whole complexity of human mental behavior, and yet they need some time to grow before they can express their mental biology. Simply because a trait only manifests at a certain age does not necessarily indicate a cultural explanation. Really, culture isn't an explanation for anything. Here I agree with Joseph Bronsky that the word culture should more or less just be banned from empirical science. Culture is a gaping void where a real explanation should go. Do they mean environmental factors like nutrition or income? Do they mean the values into which one was educated? Do they mean the way in which a person was treated by his peers? You have to be specific, and you have to actually test what you're talking about and draw correlations between specific things. Culture means nothing. It doesn't exist. There's no single thing called culture you can draw correlations with. If you want to have a sociological explanation, that's fine. You'll have to come up with a specific mechanism through which that happens. If you mean shared environment, Just say shared environment, otherwise don't bother. The next subject is differences in mental rotation. A quick overview. There's some debate about sex differences in IQ and mental abilities. Most studies show that there isn't much of an IQ gap between the sexes. Some of them show a 5-point gap, but that's mostly loaded on visual spatial IQ and mental rotation specifically, and it's probably not actually all that G-loaded. Some tests show a male advantage, some tests don't. The data really isn't all that clear on this question. People have come up with hypotheses to explain it. Evo psychs think it's the result of differential selection on men who were hunting versus women who primarily gathered. The sociologists think it's the result of gender discrimination. Now, whether this male advantage in mental rotation is real, I don't know. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But the real question is, if it is real, what accounts for it? Mooncat makes a discrimination claim, it's caused by sexism, blah, 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 blah. Evidence for this is a study that shows the effect of stereotype threat on women taking tests of mental rotation. But the problem with this is that stereotype threat is not valid proof of discrimination. If you don't know what that is, stereotype threat studies measure a person's performance on a test before and after they're primed about it, either positively or negatively. If a person's performance changes after being primed, then there's evidence of stereotype threat. An obvious problem with such studies is that the effect of being primed doesn't exist before the person was primed in the study. So the effect being measured is entirely the result of the priming, not actual extant discrimination in society. Stereotype threat studies simply do not provide evidence of an effect of societal discrimination. So there's another part in this video that I found really funny because Mooncat is making fun of some rather silly evo-psych explanations for homosexuality. But this highlights an important question for egalitarians. Is homosexuality an innate behavior, or is it learned? If human traits are all the same in a vacuum, and all differences result from cultural differences, then wouldn't homosexuality just be a cultural infliction like anything else? But homosexuality always gets a special, unassailable status among egalitarians. It's practically treated like an innate behavior. I've yet to see a single egalitarian square the mental behavioral circle on born this way and all human differences are the result of cultural differences. If you want to be really sober on this, then homosexuality is about 0.2 heritable, according to Gana et al. 2019. That's what we've seen in GWAS studies, and GWAS tends to underpredict heritability, so in reality it might be closer to something like 40%. A 1980 study on mostly male homosexuality by F.L. Whittam et al. Shows 30%. So if you want to be charitable, then a little under half of the variation in male homosexuality is the result of genetics. So yes, people are born this way. But the minute you accept that genes influence mental behavior, you also have to accept that mental behavior was influenced by evolution. And once you accept that, you also have to accept that human differences are the result of disparate evolution in humans. You can't be an egalitarian and also believe in born this way. Now there's a part in the video where she disses survey data. This is pretty stupid because surveys are a valid scientific tool and are used very widely, especially in social science. Yes, surveys may not be 100% reliable, and there can be methodological problems with the questions asked, and the participants might lie, or there might be results suppression. But in the absence of evidence that the data is wrong, you can't just assume that the survey is false. You have to actually investigate the specific study and try to figure out if the questions were misleading or if the sample is unrepresentative or prone to lying. You can't just dismiss all survey data because it's survey data. Then at some point, she brings up the so-called replication crisis. Psychology actually has about the same replication rate as other fields of science, which is somewhere around 55%. I know I mentioned the so-called replication crisis in my anti-psych video, but I'm actually wrong about this. There is no replication crisis, or at least psychology isn't especially bad compared to other fields. She points out there is sometimes data falsification or data fraud, which is true, and you should always be skeptical of research, but I don't know why this has any specific relevance to evolutionary psychology. This doesn't debunk evolutionary psychology. You have to show specific examples of fraud in the field, otherwise why are you even bringing this up? Then we get to the most predictable part of the video. Mooncat dissing some hypothetical person for not getting how genes work because traits are polygenic. And of course, some good old-fashioned, you have to find the genes for good measure. First of all, people in evo-psych definitely know traits are polygenic. No one thinks that or even thought that traits are simple Mendelian traits, but even though traits are polygenic, they still evolve in pretty simple ways. Natural selection and reproductive success mainly. Then we get to the other argument. She thinks that if you want to come up with heritability estimates or make an evolutionary explanation, you have to find all the specific genes that code for a given trait. You can't find them all, so you can't draw any conclusions. But this just isn't true. Methods of quantitative genetics work just fine for discovering how much variation in a given trait is down to genes. You don't actually have to find the genes. Leftists like Mooncat like to try bedazzling the viewer by presenting genes as enormously complicated and inscrutable, and so complex that it defies all attempt by scientists to investigate the relationship between biology and behavior. Well, despite all that complexity, there are still simple methods that let us find correlations and make predictions. One of these is, of course, twin studies, which she doesn't like for some reason. Twin studies were, and still are, valid tools for making heritability estimates, and if anything, we've gotten better at finding suitable twins for the studies. She just doesn't like them because some guy a long time ago got a eugenics award. Again, leftists are trying to smear modern empirical science with eugenics, phrenology, and other outdated ideologies without ever bothering to check if the data being discovered today is true or not. In the first place, modern science has no connection with state eugenics, and second, if the data is true, then it's true. It doesn't matter if you don't like it. Are there population differences in traits? You might not like that and think the data could be used for nefarious purposes, but your dislike of the truth or fear about the potential consequences of its unveiling is purely personal. It's not a problem with the science. If she can find an actual methodological reason why twin studies are invalid, then she can present her argument, but her personal distaste and suspicion of century-old fraud just isn't going to cut it. Following her eugenics smears, she argues that humans cannot be selectively bred for psychological traits, and her basis for this argument is that human brains are more complex than dog brains. But this isn't an argument. Humans and dogs are not all that biologically dissimilar, and drawing a hard classical-style distinction between humans and any other animal is biologically untenable. Dog brains are actually quite similar to human brains, they have all the same parts, and they map somewhat similarly behaviorally. The only reason why she's able to say humans cannot be selectively bred for psychological traits is because no one has carried out that experiment yet. Obviously, it would be unethical, so it'll never happen, so she can continue peddling her unjustified belief that there's a hard behavioral barrier between humans and animals. Personally, I don't see why we couldn't breed humans for certain behavioral traits. If we can breed foxes for docility and tameness, why could we not do the same for humans? Population level differences in violent behavior are real, so why couldn't you breed a population to be more or less violent? The rest of the video is really not worth responding to. I think I've covered most of the issues with it. Evolutionary psychology is maybe not the highest powered field in psychology. The real highest powered one is intelligence research, but the explanations that it offers for human behavior are at least valid, and some of them are undeniable. For example, to deny that human behavior has an evolutionary origin is just patently absurd. We can bicker about the whats and wherefores, but the basic position of evolutionary psychology is irrefutable. That being the case, it's only a matter of time before we begin to gain greater insight about human biological behavior. We are slowly finding the genes, we're slowly unraveling the genome. At the end of the day, the egalitarians won't be able to have the last laugh, because once we actually do find the genes, they won't have any more objections to make, and it'll become very clear that they were always just ideologically motivated from the start. They don't care about the science, and they never did.